The late 1880s were a time of great acceleration in the technology of infantry weapons, that of the rifle in particular. A transition was made in one form or another by all Western armies, from bores of roughly 45 caliber or 11 millimeter, black powder propellant, and singly loaded breech loading actions, such as this Martini Henry, to smaller 30 caliber, 7 or 8 millimeter, smokeless propellant, and magazine loading. The French led the way with the adoption of smokeless powder in the form of their poudre bée. The Lebel ushered in a new paradigm, and those various characteristics were applied, sometimes imperfectly, by those countries following on. The British answer was no exception, and after a lengthy and somewhat convoluted process, settled on a solution which featured a .303 caliber bore, a bolt action, and unique amongst its European rivals, an external box magazine which was removable. This rifle was accepted into service by List of Changes Entry 5877 in December of 1888 as simply the Rifle Magazine Mark I. This, of course, would be changed in very short order to the much more historically significant Rifle Magazine Lee-Metford. This rifle began the lineage of arms that would, albeit heavily modified with significant changes in design, serve the armies of the Empire and later Commonwealth in frontline service until the mid-1950s, when, showing its age, it was finally replaced with a self-loading rifle. But in the late 1880s, it was cutting edge, and in more ways than one. In this episode of the Firepower series, rather than examining two arms of neighboring generations, we'll pit the Lee-Metford up against itself. On one hand, we'll fire the arm as it served throughout the Empire, its 8-round magazine serving as a useful reserve. And on the other, we'll fire it as it was intended when initially adopted and explore what could have been had the Army continued to provide every man with an extra magazine. The 1880s were a complex time for small arms development, and in Britain there were actually two parallel efforts present during that decade. Initially, the development of the .402 caliber Enfield Martini was seen as a replacement, albeit only of incremental improvement, for the venerable Martini Henry. The reduction from 45 to 40 caliber was seen to yield a reasonable improvement in velocity, resulting in an increased point-blank range. Always a welcome aspect. At a similar time, much attention was being paid to the work of James Lee, who had invented a reliable and seemingly quite advanced rifle. It was a bolt-action repeater of simple yet sound design, and it included a very new and seemingly revolutionary feature: a detachable magazine held below the breech. Now, there were other magazine rifles in development or actually in service elsewhere, but none had a removable magazine. One of the tenets of this system was the ability, and indeed the intent, to have soldiers equipped with multiple magazines, thereby obviating the need to refill the magazine, instead swapping it wholesale for a full one. Today, we might think of this as being completely pedestrian, but in the 1880s this was a quantum leap in infantry firepower. This focus on the Lee rifle was paired with the eventual conclusion that a bore of even smaller than the aforementioned .402, further gaining velocity, flattening the trajectory, and providing for lighter ammunition was the way of the future. And although the .402 Enfield Martini was respectable when compared to the weapons of its generation, it was still a single-shot breechloader, and no amount of training or clever gizmos attached to the rifle would make up the deficit from a proper small-bore magazine rifle. The Enfield Martini was scrapped, and full attention and resources were focused on its small-bore contemporary. The cartridge that was eventually settled on was a development of the work of Colonel Edward Rubin of the Swiss Federal Ammunition Factory and Research Center. He had made great headway into the realm of small-bore ammunition and metal-jacketed rather than paper-patched projectiles. What resulted was the rifle Magazine Mark I. It featured a 30-inch barrel of .303 caliber, a Lee bolt action, and accompanying 8-round magazine, which was a separate item secured to the body by a clever catch, sprung by the sear spring. The bolt featured rear locking lugs and a rotating bolt head. The magazine was a relatively simple sheet metal affair, which was single-stacked and held the cartridges in place with a pair of lips at the rear of the magazine. The most obvious features of the Mark I rifle were the finger grooves in the stock and the forward-mounted sling. Both of these were to be deleted or modified in later marks. These overshadowed the less obvious and ultimately unsuccessful Lewis pattern sights, which used a slit in the foresight instead of a barleycorn. This pattern of sight would be replaced from 1892. There was much consternation about the concept of replaceable magazines and magazine fire in general. Fears of easy damage or loss plagued the development process, and the ever-present concern over ammunition wastage led to a hybrid model over that envisioned by Lee. The magazine, although completely detachable, was to be attached to the weapon with a short metal link, so that although it would still be removable, it would not be lost. The concept of multiple magazines carried by each soldier was also tempered, and only one spare magazine would be issued. The result was that a useful 16-round reserve would be held and could be fired with considerable rapidity. In addition, a feature was introduced to further curtail the risk of perceived increase in ammunition expenditure: a magazine cutoff. This would provide a control measure, further reducing overzealous shooting. Ammunition wastage remained a concern. Supply systems had matured in the age of breech loading, and the advent of magazine fire put yet another stress on an already delicate balance. Despite these concerns, and the overall greatly increased expense of the rifle, it was adopted for service in December of 1888. Manufacture had reached a point by 1890 to allow for the initial issues of the rifle to the infantry. This process was not a single united event across the army, itself spread around the empire. Many battalions were still armed with the Martini in 1892. The Mark I magazine rifle was renamed after the two men responsible for its action and barrel, resulting in that most famous name, Lee-Metford. It would serve throughout the decade, on into the Boer War, and even being evident in the early 20th century. Indeed, issues of the Mark II Lee-Metford wouldn't even become commonplace until the latter half of the 1890s. Nearly all photographs from the early, mid, and late 90s all feature the Mark I, by then modified slightly as the Mark I Star. All the British battalions engaged at the northwest frontier during the Pathan Revolt of 1897, and those deployed to the Sudan campaign of 1898 were so armed. Now, if there's one topic that deserves mention in the context of the early years of the Mark I Lee-Metford service, it's ammunition. When the Lee-Metford entered service, being issued from around 1890, the service cartridge was indeed a .303 black powder example. This was chosen for reasons that revolved around finding a suitable smokeless powder and having that process somewhat delayed. Therefore, the rifle was always intended to fire a smokeless round, but in lieu of one being acceptable at the time of issue of the rifle, a black powder one was produced as a stopgap. So, the black powder .303 round, of which there were two marks, was produced from 1888-89 until 1891, when cordite was selected as the propellant of choice and production switched. Metford rifling was chosen for this new rifle. Not necessarily for its suitability for black powder firearms, although it certainly was an excellent choice and had proven its mettle as such since the 1860s. Metford rifling was chosen as it was deemed to be an all-around good choice, which it was, until unforeseen circumstances were thrust upon it in the form of cordite, which burned much hotter than black powder and was found to erode the throats of barrels in an accelerated way. Ultimately, this led to the adoption of conventional square-bottomed rifling, which was also slightly deeper. This change resulted in a name change, and the Lee-Enfield was born, but that is the subject for another video. Ammunition, whether black powder or cordite, came packed in paper packets of 10 rounds. These were carried in the pouches along with a number of loose rounds held in loops for easy access. The ammunition for this video was the channel's typical .303 load of a 210 grain cast bullet, atop 24 grains of IMR 4227. This gives a velocity of just under 2,000 feet per second, which matches closely the spec of the service round of the era. Now that the rifle and ammunition have been presented, perhaps a short interlude to discuss the other key to this project, the personal equipment of the early 1890s. This, of course, was the 1888 or Slade Wallace valise equipment. As the 1880s waned and a new rifle and a new cartridge were about to enter service, it was deemed that a new set of personal equipment was to be adopted. It's true that the saga of the Slade Wallace set could be a standalone video unto itself, but here we'll only take time to introduce it. The set was a slight departure, an evolutionary one perhaps, from the previous 1871 and 1882 sets, but still very much of the same pedigree. Made of the customary whitened buff leather, with a black version for the rifles, it featured a belt, braces, pouches, and a valise. This latter piece was a great deal smaller than the previous patterns had been, and was fashioned with straps so that it could be donned and doffed, theoretically anyway, without taking the equipment off, or reconfiguring the braces as was the case with earlier patterns. Over its life of nearly 20 years, many different types of ammunition pouches were made and issued. As the set was introduced in the very late 1880s, and the Martini was still very much in service, there was actually a pair of pouches issued for it. Holding the standard Martini load of 70 rounds, the left pouch held 40 in packets, whilst the right held 30, 20 in packets and 10 in loops. This was to be a feature of the set's ammunition pouches throughout its service life. The first issue of .303 pouches were as well asymmetrical. They held a total of 90 rounds, with 50 in the left pouch, 40 in packets and 10 in loops, and the right pouch, that which would be used first in action, held 40 rounds, 20 each in packets and loops. Very early on, this asymmetric arrangement was superseded, with an issue of 2 identical 50-round pouches. These early years were marked with the issue of a third pouch, but more on that in a moment. These upward opening 50-round pouches were superseded by a new 1894 pattern pouch, which featured a flap that opened forward rather than upwards. This was intended to increase the security of the contents while in action. These pouches also held 50 rounds, 30 in packets and 20 in loops sewn inside the front and rear panels. Now, with the discussion of all these pouches in mind, it's critical to understand, as we discuss these rather minute points, that at no time was there a wholesale replacement of an earlier pattern pouch with a later one. Equipment and stocks thereof were used until unserviceable, and one sees, especially as the decade progresses, and certainly during the Boer War, a veritable mix of pouches within battalions, companies, and even on the man himself. The Slade Wallace set remained in service after the Boer War, and was a fixture of the first decade of the 20th century, gradually replaced by the 1903 bandolier equipment, and thereafter by the 1908 Webb equipment. The belt and bayonet frog remained on issue for ceremonial purposes. The Guards became the last users of the set, wearing it in a series of progressively simplified orders for public duties until 1939, when, on the cusp of war, their skeletonized sets of belt and braces, with only the cape rolled on the back, were turned in along with their full dress, never to be issued again. Now, we couldn't continue without mention of one more critical piece of equipment, the spare magazine pouch. Issued on the rollout of the set, the pouch for the spare magazine was a simple affair. With its angled flap, it was distinctive in shape, and when mounted on the left-hand brace above the ammunition pouch, it is highly noticeable in photographs. It was made, of course, in black leather for the rifles. The pouch appears in the list of changes in 1889, along with the contemporary ammunition pouches. Photographs of troops wearing the pouch are not non-existent, but are comparatively rare as compared to the complete body of 1890s military photography, and this is primarily due to the fact that in 1890, with the issue of the new rifle and new set of equipment barely begun, and indeed the Martini still in service in a huge number of battalions, the spare magazine and its pouch were unceremoniously made redundant and ordered to be turned in. This makes a departure from the usual British Army habit of use it until it's worn out, and reflects a decision made to stop immediately the issue, carriage, and use of spare magazines across the Army. The extra expense added to an already expensive rifle, and concerns over ammunition wastage were chiefly to blame. And so it was that James Lee's vision of a magazine-fed bolt-action rifle with ammunition carried in and predominantly fired from magazines was adopted, admittedly only in part, and then taken out of service with the stroke of a pen, before even a large balance of the Army had even received the magazine rifle in the first place. The magazine and pouch lived on, however, in artwork, and even mentioned in academic papers of the era, these both being after its demise. Presumably, this new kit arrived with great fanfare, and details of rifle and equipment spread quickly. Without the need to follow War Department dictates, artists, it would seem, could be relied upon to include the pouch, erroneously, if innocently, in their work. While on the subject of erroneous details, mention should be made of a pouch that regularly surfaces on the collector's market. A peculiar item, it is obviously intended to be mounted to something vertical, as the rear straps would indicate, and it's even advertised worn in the same position as the magazine pouch. It is not a spare magazine pouch, as the dimensions do not fit a Lee-Metford magazine in neither volume nor shape. Perhaps this item is a compass pouch or a pistol ammunition pouch, perhaps a pioneer's pouch for some of the items of their trade. Whatever it is not a Lee-Metford magazine pouch, and caution should be taken if mentioned in that frame of reference. My set of Slade Wallace equipment began life as a set from IMA many years ago. It has since gone through numerous upgrades and changes. Only the belt, frog, and brace ends remain now. The braces were made by me and relocate the valise strap loops to their correct place just behind the shoulder strap, rather than on the front of the shoulder as they come with the set. The Mark II pouches are a new addition, acquired for this project, and are reproductions from Stan at the regimental quartermaster. They hold the requisite 50 rounds in packets and loops, and vary from the historical in only minor aspects. Certainly, they are more than suitable for historical shooting or other living history or reenacting pursuits. With the demise of the Military History Workshop recently, there are very few options out there for Mark II pouches. The packets are held in 2 compartments, each with a pull tab to assist in drawing the packet out of the pouch. Interestingly, these Mark II pouches suffer from the same fault as the historical, as the packet gets trapped under the leathered keeper of the pull tab. The Mark III pouches fix this by moving the keeper lower in the pouch. The packets are opened and the contents placed in the cartridge loops across the front of the pouch. There are 2 loops on the outside of either end of the pouch to hold what might be termed ready rounds, giving access to them without having to open the pouch. The spare magazine could be charged well off the rifle, and this is done using a standard hold, ensuring that the rims of the cartridges are correctly aligned. This detail, while prudent, was not as much of an issue as it can be today, as historical ammunition had rounded rims to eliminate rim lock. Charging the magazine on the rifle needs a slight adjustment in technique. After opening the cutoff, the cartridges have to be placed on the platform with the nose up, pushing down on the platform and rotating the rim under the magazine lips. This demonstration aptly shows the time required to charge a full magazine of 8 rounds. Once the magazine was fully charged, the cutoff could be applied by pushing down on the top round and pushing in on the cutoff with the knuckle of the forefinger. For the practices shot in this project, I elected to wear marching order. The early 1890s were a comparatively quiet time for the Army, and as the spare magazine was only issued for a short time during this era, and, by photographic evidence, only on home service, well, this was when the full set of equipment was worn. On foreign service, the valise was nearly always transported. The practices shot were to be quite simple and generally conformed with those shot in other firepower videos. Because of the number of rounds, there had to be at least 16 to make the point, I decided to round it up to an even 20 and apply a bit of tactical fuzzy logic, as it were. The magazine was intended to be an emergency reserve, for when normal, singly loaded, independent fire was not sufficient. Therefore, the practices were structured thus. 4 rounds would be shot with independent fire, representing the normal part of the engagement. After these 4 were shot, the cutoff would be opened and 8 rounds of magazine independent fire would be fired. These would be followed by either a mag change and a further 8 rounds of magazine fire, or a resumption of independent fire, with the cutoff closed. Practice number 1 was 20 rounds from 100 yards in the kneeling position at a figure 2, with the use of the spare magazine. I selected the kneeling position, as that would give decent access to the ammunition pouch and spare magazine, while affording some degree of stability. As you can see, I propped the pouch flap open with the water bottle strap to allow for more timely access. The ammunition drawn from this style of pouch is very easy to get to. After the first 4 rounds, the cutoff was opened and magazine fire commenced. Notwithstanding the odd sticky case, a peril of continued neck sizing, they were fired smoothly enough. Then came the seminal moment of this project, the magazine change. It was straightforward enough, and although the magazine pouch is by no means some sort of quick draw affair, it can be a one-handed operation, as shown. The primary magazine fell out upon activation of the latch and was caught, as intended, by the chain link to dangle under the forestock. A minor point was that the primary magazine dangling away did interfere somewhat with the hold of the weapon. The eagle eye amongst you will have noticed the cleaning rod slowly working its way out of its slot, having been unscrewed by the recoil. I did have a second camera set up to capture a different angle, but a strong wind blew in from the east, and what might have been some interesting shots.
Well, there we have it. 20 rounds, a combination of independent and magazine fire with the spare magazine. Let's count these up. Maybe I could have probably used the clearing rod as my pointer, because as we saw at the end of that practice, it was basically halfway here anyway. But I digress. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So, all hits there. Not perhaps the best of groups. That said, it was a little bit, I wouldn't say rushed, but certainly with haste. It was, after all, a rapid practice, and from the kneeling position. So, I'm glad I got 20 hits, despite the fact that the group's a little bit on the wide side.
The 20 rounds were fired in 1 minute 17 seconds, or, well, 77 seconds all in. The group wasn't anything to write home about, but 20 hits is 20 hits. Practice 2 was 20 rounds from 100 yards in the kneeling position at a figure 2, without the use of the spare magazine. This practice represented the way the rifle was used operationally. Spare magazines never made it overseas, so that combination was never proven or disproven in battle. You can see here that I used the 4 ready rounds held in the external loops for the beginning of this practice. That left the 8 held in the internal loops for the end. The transition to magazine fire went along just fine, and was very similar to that of Practice 1. If it wasn't for that sticky case, it might have been perfect. Once the magazine was empty, the cutoff was closed, and independent fire resumed. The flap of the pouch had become unsecured, and although it was in the way to a degree, retrieval of the rounds was easily accomplished by feel. The threads of the cleaning rod are very coarse, and I have noticed that throughout my ownership of this rifle, it becoming loose has been a constant issue.
So, there's the combination independent and magazine fire with only the one magazine. The remainder of the rounds being fired independently. Before we count them up, however, I want to make mention of a couple of points about the Slade Wallace kit. It has a reputation that isn't always the best, and, well, I thought this might be an opportunity to discuss just a very minor part of that. After a very modern activity, literally getting up and down from the kneeling position and bending over and picking up brass, the equipment has, well, the water bottle is shifted, and the belt has ridden up right up underneath my ribs. So, perhaps a better adjustment of the set would be more something along the lines of this, with the valise high in the back, and the pouches somewhere around the natural waist. Well, here we are, and literally if I were to bend over or walk a little bit, these would end back up here. So, admittedly they're not completely full of ammunition, but they were. And now the weight has shifted, and even with the weight of the ammunition, they were still pulling up with a moderate weight in the valise, and, well, the big roll of wool, and the mess kit at the back. So, anyway, minor point, but I thought worthy of mentioning, especially it was in a bit of a lunch bucket state there. So, let's count these up. Come on. There. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So another full 20 hits on the target. The grouping's not much to speak of either. Again, kneeling rapid. Perhaps if we're going to make any mention, it's not quite so wide, but in reality it makes no difference in terms of its figure of merit. We've got 20 hits on target, and that's what we're aiming for.
This practice was shot in 1 minute 41 seconds, or 101 seconds all in. It was obviously slower, but I managed the same 20 hits. With the shooting done, the comparison could be made. Both practices scored 20 hits, thankfully, so it would be down to a question of time. 77 seconds for the use of 2 magazines, and 101 seconds with the use of 1, resulted in a 24% faster showing for the 2 magazine scheme. Now this is obviously a foregone conclusion, but one that deserved mention due to its peculiar place in British military history. The Mark I magazine rifle, or magazine Lee-Metford by its more common name, holds an important place in the development in infantry arms of the British and Empire armies. Entering service at the end of the single-shot breechloader paradigm and giving the army a new, effective, small-bore, high-velocity arm, yet it was still governed by the tactics and sensibilities that had been bred over the preceding 25 years. The rifle was issued widely from the early 1890s, and became omnipresent around the world as the infantry of the High Victorian era marched and campaigned. It would first see action on the northwest frontier during the campaigns of the mid and late 1890s, the relief of Chitral in 1895 and the Pathan Revolt of 1897. There it made its mark as a dependable weapon. Accounts exist of its devastating firepower when fired with its magazine. What was found wanting was the .303 cartridge and its bullet in particular. It was observed not to have the same kind of so-called stopping power as the previous Martini Henry had, and, initially in India and later service-wide, ammunition of a soft or hollow point nature was manufactured that would expand on impact, becoming much more destructive. But that is the subject for another video. The concept of soldiers carrying multiple magazines as their primary way of delivering fire would have to wait, and the magazine Lee-Metford and later Lee-Enfield, essentially the same weapon, would soldier on into the 20th century, holding their 8 and later 10 rounds in reserve for critical moments on the battlefield. In the wake of the Boer War, where the army faced an enemy with comparable, though charger loading rifles, this method of loading the magazine became all-pervasive. The new British service rifle, the short magazine Lee-Enfield, ushered in a new era, and it would eventually enable British infantry to combine their training with a rapidly loaded, charger-fed magazine to produce devastating fire in the opening months of the Great War. We can only speculate what would have happened if James Lee's magazine dreams had come fully to fruition. The reference used for this video was the abridged version of the List of Changes as published by Ian Skennerton. The List of Changes was the record of the introduction and subsequent modifications of all British war material, from weapons to kit and other associated items. It is particularly relevant as it outlines the dates and details of the Lee-Metford and Slade Wallace equipment in particular. An important caveat when using the List of Changes is that the dates therein reflect the so-called rubber stamp of approval and acceptance of the pattern, rather than in-service dates or dates of issue. Nearly always, a period of manufacture and stockpiling was undertaken before any actual issue took place, resulting in a significant difference in the List of Changes dates and when one would expect to see various items in the hands of troops. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well.